Okay, so this is extra mock English mock version 5. This is exactly the length of the actual English exam, except keep in mind you will have an extra 4 questions that are not scored. So your actual total will look like 28, but you get 24 possible points on English. Since this is series 5, my biggest objective really is to get through your answers quickly, because a lot of you that are taking this version and the versions around it, you're really packing this in. You're really close to your test date. You're trying to get as many in as possible. So I still think it beats a written key to go ahead and watch a video, but I won't explain a lot of these. I will just explain answer choices that look like a second best answer choice or that you might get confused with, or questions that have particular difficulty. I will maintain a column on the left side of what class everything came from. I will point out each answer, and then anything that's of interest I will throw in there, but my goal is to get this mock done quickly so that hopefully you have more time to do set 6 if you're doing set 6. So number 1 is from English 1. Which sentence is correct? That's a really simple kind of normal one. So that's going to be A. During is functioning as a conjunction. So we just need the 1 comma that separates the dependent clause from the independent. Question 2 is from English 1. Also, clearest and most correct. This is one of the ones that they're trying to get the modifiers in the right place. So the red van, which has a blue door, these two things have to go together. Otherwise, something else will end up having the blue door. And then the red van with the blue door was parked behind the building. And again, we need those 2 components to go together. One thing I noticed when I was answering this particular question that might be of a little bit of help for some of you, once I've identified that the red van is what has the blue door, I actually kind of get rid of this extra description here. And that helps me see the flow so that then I can figure out the red van needs to go with what? Well, it needs to go with was parked. And so if that helps you to take that out for a minute so that you can see how the sentence is flowing on a bigger, more general scale, you can do that. Essentially, you just want to look at what are my descriptors? What are the different things that I have in my sentence, and how do they need to be ordered in order to be able to very clearly say what I'm trying to say. So if I had the parked, if I had that up here, it would be confusing that where the red van was parked. So I need to say red van with blue door right there together. And then I need to say was parked behind the building, and that needs to follow where I've mentioned the van. Number 3 is from English 1. This is the same concept as the 2 questions we just did, except it's assembly. So we're putting together some pieces. One thing that's very important on assembly is sometimes it will very specifically say you can only use 1 sentence. Sometimes it won't. And there are times you will do an assembly clarity question that you do use more than 1 sentence. There are cases where it's not possible to get down to just 1. In this case, they are requiring just 1, and that's going to knock B and C off right away. Once you knock B and C off, if you look at A versus D, you'll see a very, very clear difference. Neither of them is the clearest sentence you've ever spoken because there's a little too much info in the scenario. But D is extremely complicated, has a lot of extra detail that doesn't have to be there, skips back and forth with the different modifiers, and it's very clearly less clear, which is the clarity concept. Number 4 and 5 are formal and informal language. Both of these are from English 2. In my recent mocks, I've talked about getting into some really, really hard formal language. And so I will say that 5 is actually a little bit too hard, I would say, and I left it in place so that I can use that to show you what I mean. But in your lecture class, we talked a lot about contractions And so we're still going to apply that, but we're going to start with all these later editions of these mocks, and you've probably already seen mock 4. We're going to start to look at some of the other weird things that might make a distinguishment between formal and informal. So on 4, I'm going to get rid of B because it's got I've. And it looks like that's the only one that's a conjunction. So that's going to leave us with, we should go to the park and have some fun. There's 2 words in here that make it seem informal. And you may not, you kind of have to get used to recognizing words that do that. And that's the point of me putting some of these into the mocks, just so you can see them. The word should and the word some, there's nothing actually wrong with them. And technically speaking, there's nothing actually informal about them. But when we're doing what we're doing here, which is comparing different choices, saying what's the most formal, what's the least formal, we will find that words like should and some, as well as words like can, and I'll explain that again when we get to the next answer, those will cause something to be a bit less formal than something else that's sitting right next to it that doesn't say should or some. Some is very relative. It does not sound precise or accurate, and that gives it an informal tone. So we wouldn't eliminate A just because it has those words. But I would kind of have a little question mark next to it, because when I read A, I would not say, oh yeah, that's definitely formal. I feel like it's informal. I may or may not know why I feel that way just yet. So that kind of gives you an idea of what you're going to compare with when you go into the other. So C says they want the meeting to go well. Want is similar to should and some, and there's a lot of those types of words. Want is a little bit more, kids say want, adults say need or would like. So want is a little less formal. Again, there's nothing actually wrong with the word. But certainly if you have they want versus they would like, you're definitely going to get rid of the want because that sounds informal. So A and C are both informal for those reasons. The other thing that I have pointed out in class before, and you may remember, is the word fun. Again, the word fun is not informal, but you would say I enjoyed the party versus I had fun at the party if you were trying to be formal. So there's just these little pieces. They don't automatically, the only thing that automatically qualifies or disqualifies a formal or informal language is the contraction. So you still want to start there. You can absolutely, so going on to 5 as I'm saying this, you can absolutely just take out sentences that are using contractions, no questions asked, no stylistic consideration. They just cannot be formal. So always start there because that is completely black and white. Once you've done that, you're comparing whatever is left and you're going to start, and instinctively you can get a lot of that comparison done easily on your own, where you can just tell what's formal and what's not formal. If you run into situations where you're getting an instinct that something isn't or an instinct that something is, the more information and context you have, the more likely you are to figure out the right answer. And that's where you can start to use should or some or fun, or here in choice C, we have the word can. If I were to be speaking formally, I would say, if you stop by the store, will you get me some apples versus can. So can is used very informally here. Again, it would not alone disqualify the sentence necessarily, but if you read D after you've read C, you can see a clear difference. You can see that C is informal, and that largely has to do with the word can. So that's not something we talk super heavily about in lecture. There is some discussion of that. That's something that you'll keep getting better at, as I pointed out in mocks, and that is intended to be that way. So if you have not actually taken any other mock that I did that in, hopefully you have already, just keep in mind you don't need to take that point from yourself. Those are actually harder questions than what you're really going to see, but they allow you to see some of the harder scenarios ahead of time while we're sitting here instead of when you're looking at them at the test. Number 6 is from English 2. This is quote punctuation. The 2 places that I looked when I went to answer this, the first is right there where that comma goes. So if there's no comma after the attribution, as is the case with C, then we definitely know that we don't have the correct punctuation. Let me try to center this a little bit bigger. So the only one that didn't, actually there's two that didn't. So there's two that are lacking the comma there. When an attribution stops and the spoken part of the sentence starts, you have to have a comma. That takes me to A and B. There's a very big difference between A and B, one critical difference, and that's right here. This is the beginning of someone's sentence. The person who is speaking is starting a new sentence. So if you're starting a new sentence, you capitalize the new sentence. That's always going to be the case when a spoken sentence starts. So that is going to leave us with A being the best answer. Number 7 is from English 2, also quote punctuation. This is where the attribution is in the middle. This is one continuous sentence. So we're going to apply the opposite perspective when we're right here. We don't want but to be capitalized because that's already part of a sentence. It's not the start of a sentence. So I automatically get rid of B and C, or I'm sorry, B and D, because we don't want but to be capitalized. That doesn't have to have been your first step. That may not have been what you started with. You might have started here again to see if they have the commas where they're supposed to be. And if you did start there, you might have noticed that A looks really weird and awkward because the comma's not in the quote like it's supposed to be. And then those two things in and of themselves leave you with C. You might not have used those exact criteria. That's totally fine if you didn't. However you've gotten used to your order. I do encourage you to have an order that you always kind of take with something like that. There's 5 different things you can check when you're trying to validate quote punctuation. So the best thing that you can do is have kind of a rhythm of how you typically do that. I always look here first, then I look for this to not be capitalized, then I look for that to be or not be, depending on the context or whatever. 8, 9, and 10 are from English 1, the spelling and word meanings that are attached. A couple of these are brand new, hot off the press. They weren't on the test 3 weeks ago, and now they are. So precisely is one you probably are familiar with, but it is a brand new word for the test. Precisely would most correctly mean accurately, and there are different sets of answer choices. So you could have this question but not have these answers, and you could have a better answer or not such a good answer that are available to you, and that's not going to be predictable. So if I had accurately, that would definitely be how I would want to answer. I don't. So the best one that I can do is carefully. And one thing I'll caution you with on this, don't pick something like slowly when you're trying to talk about being precise. So that might be tempting because if you're trying to be precise, you would be smarter to be moving more slowly rather than more quickly, right? But that is a connection to the word rather than being what the word means. So to be careful and to be accurate are fairly similar. Not perfectly, but fairly similar. To be slow would not necessarily mean you're accurate. So that's not a good, so don't attach a time to something that's not about time, if that makes sense. It doesn't necessarily have to be uniformly either. So to be precise literally just means to be accurate. You might be very accurate, but not uniform because it depends on what you're accurately trying to do. So D would be out for that reason. B and C would be out because you cannot directly correlate a speed or a pace of something with being exact about something. 9, again, this one's brand new. And again, you probably know preliminary. That would mean initial, or possibly if there were a different set of options, first. So preliminary is at the beginning of something. That's also a brand new one. And then incredulous showed up a few months ago and has been really challenging. A, because it has a lot of answer choices, and B, because none of them quite match. So the meaning of incredulous in this context is disbelieving. That's not I really hate that answer. I actually really, really hate that answer because that's not a good way to say what incredulous means. Incredulous basically means not credible or not finding credibility in something. So if you found someone to be incredulous, you don't trust them, you don't think they're credible. Disbelieving kind of sounds like the wrong type of word. It should be a little bit more like, not trustworthy or not credible or something a little bit more along those lines. But there's never answers like that. There's disbelieving. And then there's one other one that's very similar to that. Both of them seem like they're a little off from what you would actually want to say. So now you know that that's the purpose of it being in this mock, is that's exposure to that ahead of time. 11, we go through this concept in the mocks. So you've definitely seen this in at least 1 or 2 mocks before you get to this point. When we're putting together sentences in a paragraph, what we do is we find the intro sentence, and the intro sentence will list out the things that are going to be talked about. And then we want to go and find the sentences so that we put the sentences in the same order that the concepts were listed. So when I say the concepts are listed, we had an intro paragraph, and that was, or an intro sentence, and that was sentence 2. And then after the intro, or in the intro, we had, you must consider the safety. So the first thing they say in the intro is safety. Then they say nourishment. And that was the second thing they said. And then they say comfort. So we want, there's going to be a sentence. There's going to be a sentence about each of these, and we want them in that order. So we want to find the safety sentence. It so happens the safety sentence is sentence 4. Then we want to find the sentence that's about nourishment. That happens to be 3. If you identified that sentence number 2 was the intro and that sentence number 4 came after that, you were done. There were only 2 of them that had 2 in the correct spot. And as soon as you figured out what the second sentence was supposed to be, you had it answered. So your choice there is C. Number 12 is brand new. Something very, very similar to this just started to show up on the test. It doesn't really fit in any context that we have currently discussed because it's just a really weird, obscure thing. You will, if you do see this, you will see something extremely similar to this. You can assume the same answer and the same formatting if you do see this. Eventually, I'll figure out how to build curriculum around this, but right now it's just a very offhanded subject. So James decided to run for Congress in 2015, and by the end of the year, he blank to prepare his campaign. The answer to that is he had begun. Sorry, that's A, not C. He had begun to prepare. So it's not had began to prepare. It's had begun to prepare. The basic difference between began and begun could be thought of a couple of ways. The easiest way to think of it is kind of the way we think of subjects and objects. Began functions very much as a verb and very much in an active form. I began a process rather than I had begun a process. So began is usually active. It's actively happening in the sentence. It's an active verb that the subject of the sentence is taking. Begun is in past tense, which is good for this situation because we said by the end of the year he had. You can see that that's past tense. Begun goes with past tense and with a distanced version. So if began is active usage in a verb, then begun is distanced usage. Very similar to the subject and object that we discuss in English 1. 13, correct punctuation. This is from English 2 because it's apostrophes. The correct answer to that one is B. B does make a couple of assumptions. One of the assumptions is there's multiple dogs. The other assumption is there are multiple bowls. There's no reason we can't assume those two things to be true or the opposite to be true. We're basing B being correct on the fact that all of the others are misusing their apostrophe. A and D both have the same problem. They should be saying it is, which would be IT apostrophe S. So A and D have the same issue. And then C is supposed to be the possessive form of its, but we don't put an apostrophe when we do a possessive form of its. Which of the following is correctly punctuated? This is from English 1. This deals with colons and commas. And these are fairly rare, but you could see them, and we did talk about them in English 1. When I use a colon, I'm bringing a list in, and I'm doing that very quickly and suddenly. I'm very quickly and suddenly just putting a list right smack dab in the middle of a sentence without really introducing it. So the first thing you might remember about how we use colons, or rather how we don't use them, is we don't use a such as and a colon. If you're going to say such as, you don't do a colon. If you're going to do a colon, you don't use any wording that introduces the list, because the colon is the one that's doing that. So I took out B very first because of that. And then I looked at C almost looks right for a moment. And then hopefully you notice there's a comma missing before the and. That's called an Oxford comma. There's a couple of schools of thought about how commas work in lists. But as we discussed in English 1, when it comes to the TEAS, there is always a comma after every item in a list, including the one that's got an and after it. So that's what's wrong with C. And then the problem with D is you have I will buy after the colon. I will buy is not part of the list. So what we want to do is say, here's the context, and then here's the list. The context for the list is when I get to the grocery store, I'm going to buy. And then the list comes immediately after the colon, and that's going to be A. 15, correct subject-verb agreement. This is from English 3. All 4 of these answers have quantity words. When you have a quantity word, you need to identify whether it is singular, where it functions like she, or whether it's plural, where it functions like they. A, B, and C all have a function of singular, so you could put the word she in place in front of the verb. And then D is a they. D is a plural quantity word. So if I say each, and I'm going to ignore the part that comes after that, each has her own bicycle, because each could also be thought of the way that she is thought of. She has her own bicycle. A lot of you struggle with the quantity words on subject-verb agreement. Hopefully by now you're feeling like you're getting there and you're understanding them, but if you're not, make sure you go back to that. The problem with B is it says either, which is like saying she, and then says have. You wouldn't say she have her own. You would say they. Something I'll point out on C, choice C, that almost looks right until you get to the word there. So it's actually not a problem with the verb like it usually is. They have one has. That is correct. One has is correct, just like A was correct. But it's their own bicycle. And if it's one, then it's her own bicycle. 16 is also subject-verb agreement. Each child has his. So in spoken English, we very often use the word their or they when we're referring to an individual because it's gender neutral, but that is not correct at all. So when you're in written English, we discussed this pretty heavily in English 3, you can't do that. You can't say they because you don't know the gender of them. You have to say each child has his or her is actually the proper way. So if you've ever seen sentences that say his/her, that's gender neutral. But in the case of test questions, they'll just not give you more than one possibility. So you'll find out what gender is being talked about because of the fact that it's his or it's her. They will not put her there if they have his there. 17, which sentence is the clearest? This is another one of the modifier from English 1. So the one that's correct on this one is A. All of the others have pretty similar issues where they just have a modifier in the wrong order and it seems really confusing and you can't quite tell what they're describing. So I won't go into that one, but if you want more explanation on that one, you can send it to me. 18 is from English 1, spelling and word meanings, and the answer to how to spell accommodate is A. 19 is from English 1. This is basically, do I use a comma or do I use a semicolon? And then if I use a comma, do I also use more commas later on? So this is a basic clarity or correctness question. And the correct answer will be B on this one. During is a conjunction, so we need our one comma that separates the clauses. 20 and 21 are from English 1 packet, where you look at your spellings and your word meanings. The spelling for recommended is D. The spelling for schematic is B. Those are in the packet, just specifically allowing you to memorize them. 22, 23, and 24 are part of English 2 sentence structures. I strongly encourage you to be very confident with your steps for sentence structure. You always follow the same steps, always in the same order. You can literally answer multiple questions at the same time by doing that. And that's what you always want to stick to. I hear a lot of people say, oh, I just can't seem to get sentence structures down. And I'm always shocked when I hear that, because sentence structure is one of the only things that truly has a perfect, flawless way that you can do it that applies in every single instance with no exceptions. The problem, I guess, for those who still do struggle with it after that is something actually kind of unrelated. So you're either not totally following the process, or you're really not feeling confident about finding a conjunction or identifying a type of conjunction or something like that. All of that framework has to be in place, and this strategy is super critical on the test, and it is absolutely foolproof when you get it down. The strategy goes, you get rid of anything that's a fragment, and I'll tell you right now, none of these have a fragment in them. So if there's anything that's not even a sentence, you can take that out right up front. Then you're going to look for subordinate conjunctions, and I'm actually going to go through all of these and underline all of the subordinates that I can find. I could have missed one, so don't hold me to that, but I just went through and found all the subordinates that I believe are there. And then once you find subordinates, you know that you have complex sentences identified. On number 23, that's what they wanted. So you're done there. That's A. That's the only one that's got a subordinate. That's the only one that's complex. On the other two, we still need to keep moving forward. So now that we've identified subordinate sentence structures, we need to, or subordinate conjunctions, we need to identify coordinate conjunctions, which would be but, and. All of those are good. So the ones that I just underlined should be it there. Let me underline my subordinates so that that's not confusing. So I now have underlined buts or ands or ors. And then on 22, so now I'll segment down to the specific question, we want a simple. The two things that we have left after eliminating our complex sentences are, I arrived home late, but I could not get into my driveway. That's compound, because after the coordinate is a subject. So that's going to make B simple, but assumed that someone was sick. So a simple sentence structure could have no conjunction in it, or it could have a coordinate. If it has a coordinate, that coordinate will not be followed by a subject. So it will not be a place where you could split the sentence up. And then on 24, we want compound. So we're going to do the opposite. We're looking for the one that does have a subject that follows the coordinate conjunction. So that is English mock version 5. If you have specific questions, let me know. Definitely go through and make sure you know what class everything came from. You go back. If you're having trouble with anything at this point, make sure that you are focusing on the strategy of how you go through your answers and how you're going to take out things that don't belong and keep things that do. If there's anything I didn't really explain that you want more explanation on, let me know, send it to me or whatever. And then let me know what your results look like for this. If you're in extra testing, send me the results as the entire test. So send me extra mock set 1, here's my 4 scores. Extra mock set 2, here's my 4, because the way that I have them put together is based on the ratios of the tests. So you wouldn't want me to score one thing from this mock and something else from another mock and something else from the mock that you took up at the beginning. You want to put them together. So don't send me this score individually. Send me this score along with your math, science, and reading from this set. That is it for version 5. I will see you guys later.